My name is Erika. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white non-binary person with short brown and gray hair and wearing a hoodie whose text I didn't realize would be obscured by my Zoom framing, but it reads, "Access is solidarity, is disability justice, is love." And I am currently situated in what is today known as West St. Paul, Minnesota. This is the traditional homeland of the Dakota people, and I wish to honor the land itself and express gratitude to the people of the indigenous nations who have cared for this land for thousands of years, and from whom this land was unfairly ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. I'm very glad to be offering this session on disability justice today. This talk has 4 parts with corresponding Q&A sections. I've pre-recorded my entire presentation, which is the entire session, except for the live Q&A parts. On the day of the live conference, I'm here right now, live with you on May 10th, 2022, 12 to 1:30 p.m. Central Time. Although I have pre-recorded my presentation portions over this past week, my camera will be live during the 4 live Q&A periods. I did this so that I could provide for my own access to this session, and so I could moderate and respond to you all in the live Q&A. This was the best solution I could come up with on my own after learning just last week that I wouldn't have the support of a session moderator to do this job. And since I also learned last week that there would be no sign interpreters, I have manually captioned the whole thing to make it more accessible as well. If any other disabled chaplains or educators made it into my session, I welcome you. I value you being here, and I hold this solidarity as sacred. I'd also like to say a special greeting to the educators peer group gathered at Holy Family Hospital in Methuen, Massachusetts today. It's my understanding that you're all together in the big Kremlin suite, which is a space I'm familiar with from my time in CPE there in 2009 through 2011. Welcome to you and to everyone not specifically named. All right, I was told by the conference organizers to present for 70 minutes and to leave 20 minutes for questions. I am doing that, but I've broken it up into the 4 parts, which is also for accessibility. Part 1, social model of disability. Part 2 is on disability justice. Part 3 is spiritual needs with a disability justice starting point. And part 4 is about when access and accommodations are not prioritized. I want to make a content warning that the content and discussion in this session will necessarily engage with ableism, racism, and other forms of oppression, which can be emotionally and intellectually challenging to engage with. I will try to flag especially intense content before we get into it, but I realize that such experiences are subjective, and you may be affected in ways I did not foresee. I will do my best to make this session and the live Q&A times a space where we all can engage to the extent that we choose. If you want to engage with this session, you don't have to, but if you want to, I hope you will, use the live Q&A. And I ask you to follow these guidelines, which will help me to best manage our shared time. For the occasional invitations for input during the presentation, there'll just be a few times for that. Please respond only to the specific question that's asked at that time when it's asked. So don't put random questions in throughout the presentation. You are welcome to ask me anything, but please hold these anything questions until the live Q&A time comes up for that part of the presentation. There will be a slide, and I will also say thoughts, reactions, comments, questions, and that's your signal to enter your questions in the live Q&A, and which I will reply to live on video. All right? And because I pre-recorded and produced this presentation, everything except for the live Q&A time will be available on my website for public consumption and sharing as of tomorrow. So if you want to watch the entire section again, or use this presentation to educate your chaplain interns or your administrators or anyone, please do. The link is on the bottom of every slide, and it is erka.me/crip. And I think we are ready to dive in. All right, let's do this. I've begun my first class of every semester for the past 18 years by telling a room full of students a somewhat awkward story about myself, which I will now share with you for illustration purposes. The image on the current slide shows a young female presenting professor who is not me, lecturing to a socially distanced lecture hall. On day one, after I make sure students are in the right place, I tell them that I cannot recognize people by face. I cannot recognize people by face. It's true. I can't tell who's who by looking at them. And I mean anyone, including my wife, my close friends, including myself. I have a bonus awkward story I could tell you all if we do have time at the end, involving a meeting at a certain corporate headquarters where I was a chaplain and where there's a large mirror in a place where I was not expecting a mirror. But anyway, I tell my students that I have this disability, that I cannot recognize people by face. It is called prosopagnosia. That word is not important. It involves a small part of the parietal lobe called the fusiform gyrus. And that little part of the brain has one job: to recognize human faces. And mine is broken completely. And I tell students this because I need them to tell me who they are every time they approach me. So that's how I begin every class of every semester, by disclosing the nature of one of my disabilities. When I was working as what they call a corporate float chaplain, I used to do the new employee orientation at the various senior living communities. And I kind of had to include the same personal disclosure there as well. So I'd say, if you could just say something like, "Hey, Erika, it's Marcus," or whatever your name is, every time you approach me, that'll help me out. And thank you. And I'd ask them to please do this every time they approach me, because can you imagine, we have this deep, meaningful conversation one day, you and I, heart to heart, face to face. And then let's say you see me after work, maybe an hour later at the grocery store. Look, I'm gonna walk right by you like I don't know you, because I cannot tell who's who. But can you imagine that? If we had had this intimate, meaningful conversation, and then like an hour later, I just walk right by you like I don't even know you. To avoid that, if everyone could just tell me who they are every time you see me, that would be amazing, and I thank you. So, whatever. That's pretty much how I have met everyone in my life. Because one little part of my brain doesn't do its one job. Okay? And I've always kind of had this dream that I wished that everyone could just somehow be like labeled with who they are, so that I could just know who they are by looking at them. It's like a dream. Now check this out. I've got a lot of disabilities. I chose this one so that I could make a specific and central point, which I will reveal on the next slide, and I'm going to pave the way for it right now. From March 2020 through today, all of my professional work has been conducted through video conferencing. I'm very fortunate for this. I'm very grateful. But, I wished everybody would just be labeled with their names so I could know who's who just by looking at them. Well, If you've ever been in a Zoom meeting before, and if you are sight privileged enough to see the screen clearly, you know that below everyone's face, which tells me nothing, is their name, which tells me who they are. The image on the current slide shows someone standing in front of a desk and a computer monitor displaying a 5x5 grid of people in a gallery view video conference call showing faces and names. So for more than 2 years, I have not had to even disclose this particular issue to anyone. I have needed no accommodations for it. I literally started a new job last year with a small research team of folks I'd never met before. And I realized that with all of us working fully remote, you know what? I can be a little less awkward with my introduction because for the first time in my life, I didn't have to ask for accommodations pertaining to that aspect of my life. And so for the time being, I now always know who everybody is in all of my professional interactions just by looking at them. And please hear this because it's the reason I shared this opening story. Here is the punchline. Are you ready? For the past 2 years and counting, I have not been disabled by my brain impairment, even though my brain has not changed a bit. Please take a moment to appreciate that, because it's probably a paradigm shift for many of you. Like I said, I have a lot of disabilities, but if this were my only one, I went from having to disclose it to everyone and seeking accommodations everywhere to not having to mention it ever again. So I went from being disabled to being not disabled, and I didn't change a bit. It's amazing, right? So now we got a few terms to link up. What does it even mean to be disabled? Disability is a result of a person's interaction with the social world. Disability is a result of a person's interaction with the social world. I didn't make that up. It grew out of the Black Civil Rights movement of the 60s and 70s in the US, and it's really important because how you frame what disability is will kind of determine how or whether your assessments work and what you might identify as goals and how you might plan to address them. Disability results from a person's interaction with the social world. This is also how the United Nations defines disability in terms of measuring the health of populations and nations. And so me not being able to know who somebody is by looking at them, that is disability. And I assume you're wondering, what's the word for the fact that a little part of my parietal lobe doesn't do its one job, right? That's impairment. Impairment is a specific illness, injury, or functional limitation of one's body or mind, right? People can have all kinds of impairments, but the disability results from their interaction, impairments and all, with the social world. A very common expression used to make this distinction is to say that in a world full of ramps, someone who uses a wheelchair is not disabled. As a teacher, I like to add that in an educational setting, students get individual accommodations and plans, and if the setting had universal access, nobody would need any individual plans. We'd just be making things universally accessible. which we already know improves the quality of education for everybody anyway, including non-disabled students. So this is the social model of disability. Welcome. Impairments are not the problem. Impairments are just describing, the reality that people need things, different things, in order to access and participate in systems. Disability is what we can try to address, and we do that by removing barriers and increasing access. And I really want to get you thinking about how the social model of disability applies to you in your current setting. So how about if you think of someone specific, if you can, a particular disabled person. If you are disabled, you can do this thinking of yourself in the context of your workplace. This is a reflective exercise. Given our socialization in a medicalized, modern U.S. context that, abundantly privileges certain kinds of body minds or people who seem, quote unquote, normal. Most of us are probably more familiar with pointing to someone's impairments and considering those things to be the problem, when really the problem is the lack of access, which disables people. The current slide asks, how can you apply the social model of disability in your present setting? And the short answer is that you prioritize access. Stop seeing disability as something that originates within people's bodies and minds, and begin to recognize that our social world has a hierarchy in which certain body minds are prioritized and protected and others are not. Once you, yourself, once you stop seeing disability as something that originates within people's bodies and minds, you might find that you understand pretty much everything about your role differently, because you have been socialized up to this point to privilege non-disabled experiences and needs. This is an invitation to really do some transformative spiritual care. And on that note, I think I'll share one last thought before opening up for your questions for part one. In a theistic view, the divine recognizes wholeness where the world may focus on brokenness. In a broader spiritual sense, human beings are innately whole, regardless of what the world may perceive as broken or incomplete. And chaplains are in a unique position to reflect that kind of love in their provision of care. The current slide has that quote written out on it and a cartoon portrait of me next to the quote. And I think the social model of disability may be especially vital in settings where the medical model prevails and brokenness is emphasized. Thoughts, reactions, comments, questions? Part two is a quick intro to disability justice. So in about 20 minutes, you will hopefully have some preliminary thoughts on the importance of disability justice in a system. The current slide shows a somewhat famous cartoon drawn by Craig Frohl in 2012. On the left, there's 3 kids trying to watch a baseball game, but there's a fence blocking the view of some of them. There's a tall kid, a medium height kid in the middle, and a really short kid. And there are 3 crates, so each kid got 1 crate, making the tall kid taller, allowing the middle height kid to see over the fence, and not giving the shortest kid enough of a boost to see over the fence yet. So on the left, 2 crates were wasted resources because they didn't help anybody. And this shows what happens when everyone is given the same tools to start with, no matter what they need. On the right side of the graphic, now the same 3 kids exist with the same number of resources, which are the 3 crates, but they are allocated according to what each kid needs, so that all 3 kids end up being able to see over the fence. Importantly, please notice that meeting everyone's needs didn't require more total resources, just a reallocation. And I mention that because if we could actually workshop in this workshop, I would have asked you all early on to share what you've learned in your respective settings about why a space or event is not made accessible. And check this out as I read your minds with my magical powers and detect that most of you probably would have said that someone of a higher pay grade than you has said that improving accessibility is cost prohibitive. And we are going to circle back to that later. Right, the left side depicts equality of opportunity, and the right side depicts equality of outcome. And those are 2 very different ways of defining what equality means. It's a lot like the difference between disability rights and disability justice. Remember, justice always acknowledges power, privilege, and access. Disability rights and disability justice are night and day. And we are talking about disability justice, which is a framework articulated initially by 3 queer women of color, Patricia or Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, and the late Stacey Milburn in 2005. And there is so much wisdom in the disability justice arena. I've linked to a bunch of resources on my website from many different folks. Please read their work. Please buy their books. Buy this hoodie, which is from the Disability Visibility Project, led by Alice Wong. If you are not economically privileged, then follow the links to some of the YouTube videos and the blogs and just all the free knowledge they put out there. Because like many of us disabled folks, they are gifted and generous and generally underemployed. And I don't know if you know this, but most labor in justice work is uncompensated. But if we can support that labor, it's really important to do so. All right. We are going to sort of flip through the disability justice framework, and then I think we can talk about what you can do with all this. The first 3 principles are intersectionality, leadership of those most impacted, and anti-capitalist politics. And to this list, I would just emphasize that in any disability justice work, if everyone on your board or leadership is a cisgender white person, you're not doing disability justice. Our next set of principles includes cross-movement solidarity, recognizing wholeness and sustainability. And what I will highlight here is regarding cross-movement solidarity, because there are disabled folks in every group. So it is a sincere solidarity, but it does make for 2 key challenges. On the one hand, the white disability communities need to be confronted about their racism. And on the other hand, a lot of the other justice movements need to be confronted about their ableism. I'm telling myself that you're all gonna do more reading on your own as I speed through some of these. Got the last 4 principles here. Commitment to cross-disability solidarity. That's about what we do in our own house, so to speak. It's making sure we don't form hierarchies within disability spaces, because that can happen. So everyone who experiences ableism needs to be in solidarity. Collective liberation is a sort of grounded, inspirational mapping principle for the work of social movements, because liberation has always required acknowledging the collective. These middle two, the principles of interdependence and collective access, are my two personal favorites. Interdependence is particularly relevant for chaplains in senior living communities, which tend to heavily advertise so-called independent living as what they offer. And it's not their fault. I do not blame them. They do their market research, and that's the brochure that sells contracts. There's a lot of public discourse about this within gerontology on the association between independence and accomplishment. And you know the senior living brochures I'm talking about. They describe residents and when they will someday reluctantly need assistance, and that they'll be able to transition from independent living to assisted living and stuff like that. And I mean, look, life is assisted living. We really, literally, we all need one another. Every individual person's well-being is inextricably connected to that of their neighbors. In contrast to independence, interdependence is about caring for one another. And it's just real, because nobody is independent. That is not a thing. We just say it sometimes. It's not real. As a disabled chaplain, when I was actively working as a chaplain, I can remember how much relief and peace I was able to give residents in senior living when I gave them permission to stop trying to pretend they're independent, because none of us is. All right. Last one with collective access. Collective access, everyone just assumes that people have certain needs and that together we're going to figure out how to get things done. Sharing access needs in disability spaces isn't the big, vulnerability it is in the rest of the world, because we know that our strengths are recognized and valued with collective access. It's like teamwork and community wrapped in shared responsibility and all the good non-competitive ways that only Crip spaces know how to be. I mean, nobody feels the need to apologize for having an impairment. People don't have to beg for accommodations. Disabled people are not a burden. Lack of accessibility is a burden, and we will share it for one another. Ableism is a burden in the same way. And together we will figure out how to get folks' needs met. Collective access is beautiful. And I could talk about that for a bit. But moving on. The image on the present slide is of a white man wearing a casual button-down shirt and glasses with neatly groomed gray head and facial hair. He's shrugging his shoulders, saying, "That all sounds fine and good, but what can I actually do with this in my setting?" I've named him Donald, by the way. And I guess that's a fair question, Donald. Although I just gave some ideas over the past few slides, but here's another one. In fact, it is the very first thing you can start doing tomorrow. And we can do it in a minute right here, right now. And it is to ask yourself what I consider to be the first question of disability justice. Who is not here? This little question is about access. And the answers and honest explanations for the answers are about power and privilege. So we could ask who is not here in this 90-minute conference session with us right now. The image on the current slide shows the same gray-haired man as before, Donald. In this photo, he's looking pensively off to the side, and apparently he found himself a cup of coffee somehow. In the interest of time, I am going to jump ahead to share the tally from an informal Facebook poll I conducted about this question, because researchers gonna research. I asked the question, are you attending this year's APC ACPE conference, May 10th to 12th? I asked in a group of about 70 disabled chaplains, and 29 responded. Their responses are sorted here by popularity, with the most common response being no, too expensive, followed by no, cannot get time off work. And those two reasons alone account for more than half of why the disabled chaplains, of those who responded, said they would not be here. A few said they were gonna be here, and 2 are here despite access difficulties. And by the way, hello friends. Please share your thoughts in the group later today, by the way. I would love to hear from you. But I mean, I'm not going on about this. This is what it is, and I share it with you all in case anyone in attendance has any interest in justice within APC and ACPE. Because, again, when you ask who is not here, that little question is about access, and the answers and honest explanations for them are about power and privilege. If you want to do disability justice, well, you will have your action steps right in front of you if you want them, my friends, starting with some honest answers to that first question. And with that, I will wrap up part 2 and open for your thoughts, reactions, comments, questions. Part 3 is on recognizing spiritual needs in an intersectional lens with a disability justice starting point. Part 3 of this presentation, with its selected illustrations, does include mention of child loss, violence, racial trauma, and disability trauma. And I am mindful that folks who have experienced these or similar causes of spiritual pain may be affected differently than those who do not have this experience. Please take care of your heart. And if you need distance, please do take that distance and then come back. My hope is that in naming trauma and oppression as a cause of spiritual distress and pain that chaplains routinely encounter, that all chaplains may find themselves inspired, if not compelled, to work towards disability justice, universal access, and solidarity with the most marginalized in their provision of spiritual care. May we somehow find comfort in such a hopeful tomorrow. Categorically looking at causes of spiritual suffering, one category is generally expected stressors. We know how to chaplain, I'm just making that a verb, when folks present with things like return of cancer, death of a grandparent, routine life transitions, or other chaplain-y things that can cause spiritual distress and pain. We listen, validate, find out more, respect the patient's own meaning-making systems or faith traditions, and figure out how we can help them to best connect with some of those resources in order to cope with their crisis, change, or loss. Another category of causes of spiritual suffering is critical incidents or violence. And these causes of suffering are somewhat less common. Things like a mass shooting event, sexual assault, the traumatic death of a child, death by suicide, or something deemed to be out of our control altogether, such as natural disasters and having a loved one who died in a tornado, for example. What do? Well, the same chaplain tools as in the first category generally do still work. We listen, validate, find out more, respect the person's own meaning-making systems or faith traditions, and figure out how we can help them best connect with some of those resources. Additionally, since we tend to call these things trauma, we might make sure there's a referral to mental health support if needed. And for providers, we even have whole teams that try to support them through coping with these causes of suffering. And the spiritual care for folks in this category is within the realm of what we do as chaplains. Sometimes also just affirming that in their response to trauma, whatever their response may be, they are having a normal response to an abnormal situation, as CISM puts it. There are more categories of spiritual suffering. This is not an exhaustive or perfect layout here, but for time I need to get into the tough one. When the cause of spiritual suffering is oppression, which is always intersectional. This spiritual pain is categorically different. Oppression in general is prolonged, cruel, or unusual treatment. It's like the tornado didn't pass through town in this case. That tornado scooped some people up, and they are still up in the air in that tornado, where they will just stay until they die. It's like a mass shooting that never ends, and folks are just hiding under the table forever because their lives are at risk. But the added cause of pain here is that not everybody knows or even cares that you're up in the air in a tornado or under a table trying not to die. Oppression as a cause of spiritual pain is different. And ableism is oppression that privileges the protection and care of certain body minds while excluding and deprioritizing other body minds. A disability justice perspective reminds us that multiply marginalized people are the most oppressed and the most in need of access, solidarity, and care. What does the chaplain do when spiritual pain comes from oppression? Well, we have our spiritual assessment frameworks, which I'm going to call tools now for brevity. These all have a common lineage with psychological assessments and a clinical framing of problems. And they're all based on some assumptions like individual autonomy and empowerment that do not apply when the person in need of spiritual care is multiply marginalized and at least one cause of their spiritual suffering is oppression. Do the tools work? When you go into maternity in a hospital, and a Black mom's physical pain is not being adequately managed, because we know that providers tend to overestimate Black patients' pain tolerance and therefore undermanage their pain. That's ableism and racism. Nothing indicates that she needs help finding meaning or purpose, calling her pastor, connecting with her faith community, or coming up with a ritual about pain. She needs access to the medical care she's not receiving right now. Our regular chaplain tools are designed to identify individual level causes of spiritual pain and to search out strengths and deficiencies in individual level spiritual resources, all of which presume autonomy and empowerment in the context. These tools do not work when you're visiting a woman in stage 2 of labor who's also kind of mad, yet terrified. At the same time, mad and terrified, to the point that you go check her EMR to make sure she might not be rational or something. Why is she mad? Is it because her provider isn't managing her pain? Or is it something else? Why is she terrified? What if you, as a chaplain, didn't know that Black moms are 3 to 5 times more likely to die during pregnancy and delivery than their white peers? And that's even when controlling for income, health insurance, and education. What if the causes of her spiritual suffering are categorically oppression? These things are structural. That's ableism and racism. How can you support her spiritual well-being when you are a part of the oppressive structures literally threatening her life today? Can you assess her spiritual needs using your existing assessments? I suspect that some of you want to say yes, but really, I just want to encourage you to give some thought to whether your assessments are valid when the cause of spiritual pain is oppression and the person is not lacking any known spiritual resources. They've got all that covered. It's the oppression. I suggest that what this mom needs for her spiritual well-being is justice. And anything less is just window dressing in front of the biggest elephant that can possibly fit in a room. I'm intentionally not going through specific methods because I didn't want this to become a teardown of any particular assessment framework, but I have done it on my own, and I encourage you to look at your favorite one, your tool, with new eyes, and for when the cause of someone's spiritual pain is oppression and the assumptions of the tools don't apply. And they're not missing any of those spiritual resources that are usually what we address in spiritual care. I'm not the boss of the world. Like, I needed to tell you that. You can continue doing whatever you believe is best. I only ask that you give this your sincere attention. If someone's multiply marginalized, what they need is to have their access needs met. How does that happen? Through interdependence, collective access, and the other principles of disability justice. And to hear that explained in another voice, please listen to the 2018 keynote speech from Mia Mingus on Access is Love. I linked it on the website. I'm really just substituting spiritual care in for love. Spiritual care equals access, equals solidarity, equals disability justice. This here is the work of Alice Wong and the Disability Visibility Project, building off of Mia Mingus's Access is Love speech. And the bottom line is, we don't get to justice by using our existing chaplain tools. But I think we need to get to justice if we're going to actually care for people's spiritual health. I'm going to wrap up this section by sharing 2 brief personal stories from a lifetime of them. This is hard for me, but I share because someone will inevitably tell me later today that my sharing helped them find their voice. And that's why I do it. And if you are abled or non-disabled, you might be inspired by something I share to use your privilege to do something for disability justice, because you're not going to be ignored in ways that people like me are ignored. Because of our intersectional identities, we can all be marginalized in some settings and privileged in others, and it's true for me as well. As a non-binary, queer, disabled person, I'm very familiar with being treated like I am less than human and with being completely ignored when I try to get my access needs met. So you might think that if you were my chaplain, for example, maybe it sounds like I'm struggling to remember my inherent worth since I'm repeatedly experiencing being treated as less than human. But I am not. I'm struggling to bear the weight of repeated affronts to my humanity within systems where nobody seems to care. And these are very common experiences. I'm just telling my own stories because I really don't like telling other people's stories. Let's do this. Story 1, this is from last month. I am a disabled veteran. I was attending a required CMP exam regarding 2 of my injuries related to military service. The provider who was doing the exam treated me in every way as less than human, starting with how she snapped her fingers at me in the waiting room, like how you might call in your dog from the yard. When she was filling out her form, she had to ask a bunch of questions, one of which was about employment. For some reason, she paraphrased that question, so she asked it by saying, "Do you do anything?" Which I didn't understand. Do you do anything? What does that mean? So I asked her, "What do you mean?" And then she yelled at me. And she spoke slowly, sounding it all out as if I don't understand words. When she said, I'm going to do it now. Do you do anything? Do you have a job? That's how she did it. It feels gross. And it felt gross to be talked to like that. I said, I do. I'm a professor and a population health researcher. She shook her head no, as if I just made that up. And she went on with her questions. And she rapidly asked a whole bunch of questions about specific dates and details about things that happened 30 years ago. For this, I pulled out my typed out notes because I knew that was a part of this exam, so I had my notes ready to go. And when I went to look at my notes, she made fun of me for having notes. I happen to need the notes because of one of my cognitive impairments. I'm a genius with a broken brain, lucky me, and having notes is an accommodation that works well. But she teased me about having them. There is a lot more, but I'm going to stop because otherwise I will start crying. It was a horrible experience. And if you happen to be in a position to take any kind of official report about this VA CMP exam and how I was treated, if you can take that report into a space where someone will listen to you, I would be grateful for a contact later and your support, because despite my efforts, nobody seems to care. Story 2. One more story of ableism from the past few months. There's so many stories I could choose from, but you'll see why I had to include this one in the mix in a moment. I started asking about accessibility of this session that we're in right now. 3 months ago, I asked about my own access needs, and I asked where I could find out about accessibility considerations that would be available for attendees of my session so that I could prepare an accessible presentation. In my emails, the ones in which I ask questions about either my own accessibility or the accessibility of you all, those emails were never even answered. I mean, here I am doing additional uncompensated labor, and I'm doing it because I believe this topic is important. I offered this session initially in order to speak up for all the disabled chaplains who have been tokenized, if not fired, and have had their stories co-opted by others while they are silenced and their access needs go unmet. For them, for my people, I tarried on in spite of being ignored, and I figured out how to make this session relatively accessible for myself and for you all, despite lack of accessibility in the system. And to be clear, they responded to my emails that did not ask about accommodations, both before and after the ones that did. They just ignored the emails with accessibility questions. And it's not just a matter of someone ignoring emails. It's that question. I mean, if someone's drowning and they ask you to throw them a life ring and you don't answer and they die, you didn't just not answer a question, you know what I mean? They ignored the emails in which I asked about accessibility, and they answered my other emails. That's a lot. And that reflects values, and it's hurtful, and it's ableism. And I will personally not renew my APC membership later this year, just as a matter of self-respect. But I believe in professional chaplaincy. And I hope that folks who are abled, that is non-disabled, can work on accessibility within APC and ACPE both, in terms of their websites, first of all, and their conferences, and their communications with disabled chaplains. If you are abled and you care about justice, you should speak up, because they will listen to you, where, as you can see, they will literally ignore us. We need you. So those are 2 stories. Everybody's different. Just remember, ableism is exhausting, demoralizing, and way too familiar for all of us. On finding that disability justice starting point, Cornel West says justice is what love looks like in public. And disability justice teaches us how to actually care for one another, says Lydia X.D. Brown. You're going to need to have the confidence in your own competence in order to not follow models rooted in white ableist social norms that deny the realities of structural inequality, which can account for so much spiritual pain. We need you. That is my message of this part of the talk. And this truly deserves an interactive session. I'm sorry that is not possible, but I will wrap up my part of part 3 here. And if the live Q&A is working, let's try to connect there for your thoughts, reactions, comments, and questions. I'm recording this in advance, as you know, but I'm guessing that the live Q&A time we just had was probably not long enough, given all that was covered in part 3. I think that's the nature of a topic worth investing in, that we run out of time before all questions can be answered. I have at least initially turned on the comment section on the website for this presentation. If you're watching this video at a later date, I may have turned off the comment section by that time. But for those of us live now at the conference, for at least a week, I will leave the comment section open. And I'm doing that for those questions that didn't get answered in the live Q&A time. If you'd like me to respond, go ahead and ask me on there and I'll reply. Right. So part 4, where the learning objective is to assess spiritual support needs in a setting where access and accommodations are not prioritized. As it turns out, I kind of addressed this goal in the previous section, right? I'm also literally not aware of any public, educational, or healthcare setting in which access is a priority. I mean, there are intentional sort of disability justice spaces, but those are islands. For pretty much everywhere else, access is not prioritized, and assessing spiritual support needs is about justice, which is access, which is solidarity. And you know what? It sometimes seems so complicated, but it's not. Whatever anyone's body, mind needs, that's just something they need. By the way, you know the word body, mind? If that hasn't come up, it's a real word, and I encourage you to use it. It's just body and mind as one thing, body, mind. Google it for more information about it, but it's really useful. And whatever anyone's body, mind needs, they just get to have that need, and it's okay, and they don't have to apologize for having needs. I'm sure you've heard people say that before, and if it hasn't been you saying it, imagine sort of having that experience, you know, being blind and saying, "I'm sorry, I'm blind, but can you please read this to me?" or something like that. What? Look, if you need extra reminders because your body mind has dementia, then you need extra reminders. And one of us who's good at that will do it. If you need to fidget in order to listen, then fidget, because we want you here. It's all socialization and norms that tell us what's appropriate behavior. And a lot of those norms are ableist. If you need to get up and stretch your legs or use facilities because 90-minute workshops are kind of long, you get to do that. It really is a more Western, capitalistic, ableist social order that we even frame people's needs as, or characterize them as like burdens, rather than as opportunities for generative things. And you know what? With accessibility, that's the spiritual care. Because we're talking about interdependence. How we respond to someone's needs can either lead to public shame, or it can present an opportunity for caring. Honoring our interdependence is potentially transformative, and we miss all of that. Relatedness. By dismissing needs as burdens rather than recognizing them as opportunities. I really think that's the true thing for spiritual care and disability justice, because when someone's access needs are not met, that actually tells us more about the setting or the environment than it does about the person. It's less of an assessment of the individual and more of an environmental assessment. When someone's access needs are not met, we have failed them. That's not an assessment of them. That's an assessment of us. So what can I do? You can do absolutely everything through an intersectional disability justice lens. Remember way back when I said what I consider to be the first question of disability justice work? Always ask yourself, who is not here? That alone can keep you pretty busy. And when people's access needs are not prioritized, that tells us that the folks with power, privilege, and established access are not valuing so much the person whose access needs were not met. Responding to that need, even if that means pointing some stuff out, that's spiritual care. For a simple example, check it out. I told you I can't recognize people by face. And I told you how great it's been on Zoom because the people are labeled. Well, look, what if I go back to work face to face? I've kind of enjoyed not being disabled in this way for the past few years. I still can't recognize people by face, but think about it. Can you think of some way, if I were to return to a face-to-face, in-person work environment, how could people be visually labeled with their names? Does such a thing exist? Of course it does, because I've thought about it every day for the past 26 months. And you know what? Yeah, if they value my participation, they could wear name tags. Is that a burden? No. It is an opportunity for something generative, which I would experience as love. Meet my access needs, don't meet my access needs. Either way, it's a choice, and it tells me what you value. And it's chaplain work to be promoting institutional change in ways that lead marginalized people to be treated right. It definitely is. So what else can you do? You can give patients and staff and yourself as needed permission to stop pretending we're independent and embrace our interdependence. You can deal with the racism in the white disability communities if you're white and in those spaces. You can address the ableism in every other justice community. You can make sure those most affected by policies are actually at the helm of determining them and not tokenized. And I think that's a good list. If you get all that taken care of, let me know. All right, I have an idea. This is quick, but it's going to make a point. And it's going to have you typing into the live thing in a moment. I want you to picture a corporate cafeteria somewhere, like a hospital or university or your workplace. And to help you visualize, I've crammed 3 different cafeteria photos together on the present slide. They are not meant to be showing anything special. These are intended to be 3 generic cafeterias. And here's the question for those of you who are sight privileged. Do you see any accommodations? Do you see any accommodations? Please use the live Q&A now to respond. And just type in either no, if you see none, or just briefly name whatever accommodations you do see in the photos. If you cannot see the photos, these are meant to depict ordinary cafeterias, and I'm not asking about any unique things that any one corporation might have instituted, but just seeking an overall take on today's cafeteria situation. So I invite your participation about whether you see any accommodations in any generic cafeteria. I'm telling you in a second, I'm going to tell you what I do see in every cafeteria, and it's probably not what you're thinking. While you were answering, I promise I was reading your submissions live, even though I cannot time travel back and put responses into this video. Let me tell you what I see in these photos and in every cafeteria. There's a lot of chairs provided at all the tables. Why are all these chairs provided? Hang in with this. This isn't long, but it's a good one. Why does the institution provide these chairs? Is it because people who walk tend to get tired from walking and standing, so that while they're eating their lunch, they want to sit down in order to rest their tired walking legs? And even though they need to rest their weary walking legs, approximately 0 such walkers will ever bring their own chairs to the cafeteria to meet their own needs. Leg fatigue has nothing to do with food, but you mean the institution just pays for all these chairs to support the rest and recovery of the weary legs of the walkers. Do I have that right? I mean, can these institutions just not provide chairs? Would that be acceptable? I wish I could hear your reactions, but if you've never thought of cafeteria chairs in this way, that is because of ableist social norms that lead you to believe that certain body minds unequivocally deserve care and support, and certain other body minds are a burden and a nuisance and something we can ignore and certainly do not have to address in our budget. The irony with the cafeteria chair thing is that to be wheelchair accessible, for example, they basically remove a chair. It's cheaper to not buy that chair, and it costs nothing. But it's done for disabled people, so even that is viewed as a burden to the institution and an accomplishment. We have been socialized to privilege non-disabled experiences and needs. And disability justice challenges our socialization. Everything we observe reflects underlying policy, and these policies represent the institution's values. And we feel that. Spiritual care should tend to the pain point and challenge those who make the policies to make better ones that recognize everyone's humanity. The image on this slide is the speaker showing the words printed on her hoodie that read, "Access is solidarity, is disability justice is love." As spiritual care providers and educators, you have an important role in the well-being of many people. Don't accept ableism. Always ask who isn't here, and then respond to what you learn about yourselves. And insist that your setting become a place that does prioritize access, where everyone deserves to be cared for because of who they are, not in spite of it. Thank you.